From UBN Studios, you're listening to Unsugarcoated with Aalia, bringing you interviews with public figures and inspirational people speaking on self-improvement with empowering themes. And I'm your host, Aalia Lanius. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Unsugarcoated with Aalia. As you know, we are continuing this incredibly special curated season, as I've said, the most important season I've ever produced because of the topic. Our theme, from Los Angeles to Gaza, a plea for humanity. It's been stressful. It's been emotional to conduct these conversations. But of course, that is nothing compared to the people living it. You know, I continue to see daily videos of Palestinians suffering, being killed, being pulled from rubble, being completely obliterated, and nurses, hospitals, everything. The list goes on, and it's devastating. It's devastating to know, quite frankly, that the world stands by and somehow condones this. But there are a lot of people that want to focus on October 7th, which, albeit a horrible day, if we can be upset about this day, we have to be upset about every day since then. And less than 2 blocks from my house last evening, there was a screening held of the events. It was hosted and put together by Gal Gadot, and a woman that, I had previously hoped, and as having children that are part Palestinian myself, I loved the character of, I've loved the character of Wonder Woman since I was a child, and I really hoped in her even playing the character that it would be a sign of potential peace, of potential mutual agreement, of integrity and decency that should be allowed between two cultures. We need to bring people away from extremist ideas. So that was frustrating. I value the importance of filmmaking and documentarian work, one of which is because we know how it is a double-edged sword. It is a sword that can cut you free from the lies that you believe, and it can also stab you in the heart, as we know Joseph Goebbels did when he created the propaganda and rhetoric that fueled Nazism during World War II. And it's something that I really feel is critical. We also know that democracy dies in darkness. And what we're seeing right now is targeted efforts to shut up journalists, to kill them even, to kill their families, to tell them to shut up. We're seeing influencers and people of notable stature that are being told, be quiet, you're speaking for terrorists. And I know it's not the case. So in this, I'm grateful for the people with their experiences that have come onto this season as we continue to push the needle forward in the name of humanity. And so today we're joined by a filmmaker, journalist, and an activist to share this conversation on why storytelling is critical when it comes to humanity, as well as his own personal experiences. Thomas Maddens is a filmmaker and passionate activist, focusing on vital issues such as human rights, climate justice, and reproductive rights. Together with his wife and partner, Ellen Andries, he co-founded a Mad production a decade ago, dedicated to producing impactful films and campaigns centered around these critical themes, collaborating with organizations, creatives, and activists. Thomas's journey as a filmmaker has been nothing short of extraordinary. He spent the initial decade of his career documenting humanitarian crises for the United Nations, bearing witness to some of the world's most pressing challenges, and finding innovative ways to communicate them to global leaders at the UN in New York. His extensive work covered regions in crisis, including Eastern Congo, South Sudan, Nepal, Iraq, Palestine, Gaza, and many others. Beyond his humanitarian efforts, Thomas leads a team that captures survivors' testimonies from various genocides, including the Holocaust, Rwanda, and shedding light on these important narratives. In addition, Thomas and his partner co-produced Mayendo, a film that played a pivotal role in changing societal perspectives on endometriosis in Belgium, ultimately leading to the creation of the nation's first law addressing this condition. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Thomas Maddens.
Thank you so much, Aalia. And thanks for having me today.
Oh, it is genuinely my pleasure. I always love to give the origin stories of our guests. Again, thank you for joining us. I know there's a time difference and these issues are critical. People like yourself were getting pulled on from all different directions. But your story from the beginning has been transcontinental, correct? And so how did that impact and shape your earlier years?
So my father is a diplomat, and so he's a Belgian diplomat. And so actually I spent my young life moving around with him, and we were stationed in various places, from Caracas in Venezuela to New York to Vienna to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and then coming back to Belgium to go to film school. It very much instructed my work in various ways. On the one hand, there was this really kind of multicultural element of the expat community that we were living in, which is kind of this, it's not really realistic representation of what multiculturalism is, but it was the way in which I grew up. But mainly, I think what instructed my work the most was very early exposure to really intense forms of injustice and privilege, and the different worlds and the different places that people find themselves in. And now I've come to learn that a lot of that is to do with, oppression-oppressor dynamics. But it very much kind of instructed the reason why I wanted to become a filmmaker, which was, one, I wanted to understand the mechanisms of the world, the geopolitical kind of structures of the world. I was never interested in like kind of war journalism or that kind of thing, because that really didn't interest me. What interested me more was the strength of people who were able to flee war and continue to survive. I basically spent the first 10 years of my filmmaking career doing that. And I had this thing in my head of like, okay, if I work for the UN, that's a way that I can see the world, and I can use my camera, and I can visit the crises of the world and find ways to communicate these to geopolitical leadership, which is exactly what I did. And it really opened my mind in a way. It was very traumatizing at times as well. But I also started to see the interconnectedness of it all, that these weren't just isolated crises and events, but that they were all kind of interconnected in this, a greater existential crisis, which brings me to my work in the climate crisis.
Because you have worked with the UN closely and you have this purview, a lot of people feel like, why does the UN not step in? Like, why are we not rolling in and being like, yo, both you guys need to stop, or you know what I mean? This needs to stop. We need to get this. Like, why is it that when we feel that there's this power here that's supposed to kind of be the, the altruistic body, why do we not see that?
It's a frustration that I share, for sure. Definitely having worked at the UN and having gone through various kind of memorial ceremonies of the genocide in Rwanda and other genocide-specific work that I was involved in at the UN, it is really frustrating right now because with my knowledge about genocide, and I've done hundreds of hours of interviews with survivors from various genocides, but a lot of them around the Holocaust and Rwanda specifically, all the red flags are there and have been there for decades when it comes to Israel and Palestine. So it's really not, it's not a stretch to say it. I don't understand why everyone is kind of tiptoeing around the term, because to me, having been there, it's extremely clear what was going on because it was so blatant. It wasn't trying to be put away. But the UN, I think Guterres, the Secretary General, was very early to use some of the strongest language of any kind of global leadership. I think the tricky situation that he's in is obviously he's not like an authoritarian dictator where he can just kind of, decide how it is.
Right.
The UN is a global platform. It's a place, like, for example, the General Assembly is a place where it's the biggest kind of arena for geopolitical leadership to have a voice. So that's mainly its goal and its use, is to provide a platform for the world. Now, if we're talking about the Security Council, that's supposed to be the instrument with which we can address this type of situation. Unfortunately, the permanent member veto of the Security Council, I personally think it makes it completely an irrelevant instrument because, and we've seen it again now, is if the permanent members can veto so easily and so simply and just stop any action from being undertaken, what's the point?
Right.
I mean, there is a mechanism where if the Security Council veto happens, they can go back to the General Assembly and with some kind of resolution circumvent the veto, but it's a very, as I would say, it's very UN. It's very complicated and it's very slow and it's very complex and it's, but I understand the frustration and I definitely share it. But I also think people overestimate maybe sometimes the power of the UN in that regard, because it's not necessarily what all of it is designed to do. Because obviously there's so many different elements to the UN as well. You have the General Assembly, you have the Security Council, you have all the humanitarian organizations.
Right.
So there's so many levels on which it plays. But I absolutely share the disappointment and the appalling decisions being made by the Security Council at the moment. It's just it's frightening.
It's very much so, and I agree with you, and I thank you. You know, is it something that more younger people need to be, you know, comfortable getting involved? Because a lot of us, and I'll say this even for myself, when I was younger, okay, the adults will figure this out, right? But I think that by the time people really start recognizing, wait a minute, this does impact my life. I want to be I want a seat at those tables. Like, do you feel that one of the critical things is for other people, younger generations, to start being involved, not let the older guys in the room make those decisions?
100%. I mean, if you look at those kind of family portrait pictures of big organizations like the UN or like even like NATO or those kinds of organizations, it's still, and sorry to stereotype, but it's still a bunch of old white men.
Yeah.
There's no, let alone that there's like a diversity in terms of skin color. There's also very few women still in these spaces.
Right.
And so there still is no real diversity in these spaces. So I feel like if we're not even at that point yet, then we're not really getting diverse opinions being heard. I know in the last few years, there's been this really like conceited effort to bring young voices in, particularly around things like climate. That's something where young involvement is really a key has become a key thing. I think young people need to recognize their power as well. And this whole apathy towards politics and democracy and getting involved in this, I think even just strategically, it's a bad decision to not be involved, because as a friend of mine who's he's in the federal parliament in Belgium, he's a politician here. He often says, like, if you don't care about politics, politics cares about you. So whether you're going to get involved or not, it'll drag you around. So like, I think there is absolutely value in getting involved. I think, and you can do it in so many different ways. You can do it by, you know, being loud on your platforms, or you can do it by organizing and mobilizing and doing things. You can do it by, you know, getting together in your schools and doing actions or things like that. Or you can do it by voting or that kind of thing. So there's like, it's not that it's like this one size fits all kind of way of getting involved. I've always had this sense of like, I had privilege in my upbringing, and I am going to use every ounce of that privilege that I have to fight injustice. And that's a really intense responsibility that I feel. And I know not everyone feels that, but I think I urge people who have the capacity to do it, to do that, because we are careening towards, I mean, Israel-Palestine is just one example, but we are careening towards a completely inhumane and inhuman world. And we have to stand up against it, because it's not humanity will not make it.
You know, I mean, for people who aren't aware, there's, of course, I know you are, is they predict that by 2050, 1 billion people will be displaced, you know, and when we look at how people can't seem to get along, I don't think they understand. We might need each other in this world. We need each other. We do need each other. So in that, segueing into that, you have your own personal experiences in Gaza. You know, please share with our audience, you know, first of all, what was that like? What brought you there, and what was your experience like?
It's a bit strange. I mean, to some people it may sound strange, but from when I was a kid, Gaza specifically was number one on my, I don't want to call it a bucket list because that has like a positive connotation, but this was more a fascination of places that I wanted to go, because I wanted to understand. Because I remember as a kid with a diplomat father, when he would have like colleagues over and they would discuss things and I would kind of pick things up as a kid. I remember when it was Israel-Palestine, and particularly when we were living in New York at the time, it would always be this really intense conversation. And it was like nothing else that anyone talked about. And that was how I kind of interpreted it as a kid. But then as I grew up, I started reading more about it and I watched documentaries. I saw Louis Theroux's a documentary on Zionism, and I saw all these, and Five Broken Cameras, you know, the Academy Award. I think it won the Academy Award at one point, or it was nominated. And I have this real kind of sensibility towards injustice, and when I see it, I want to kind of get involved and get my hands kind of dirty in a way. And to me, my theory of change really is storytelling, and I think the best way to do that is to go to a place and meet the people and talk to the people and get an understanding of the situation. Because, you know, you can read books and you can see films, but that's just still one person's perspective. That's not my own perspective. And so when I was working for the UN, I was constantly trying to find these opportunities to go to Gaza and to try to understand what was going on. And a few times we wanted to make it happen, but then the security situation changed and then we couldn't get in. In 2017, there was a window where we could get in, where we could cross the border into Gaza. I mean, we flew into Tel Aviv and went to Jerusalem and then crossed the border and went into Gaza. It was such an onslaught to everything. It wasn't even that, because at that time the situation was somewhat stable. It wasn't right after a war. It wasn't, or right after an escalation in the conflict, or it was kind of a stable situation. But the stories I heard from people, and just going into Gaza itself, like crossing that border and crossing that wall and seeing like the sentry guns and, you know, illegal weaponry by international humanitarian law to cross into this border, and to see the level of oppression was completely, in my experience, unrivaled. And this was after I had gone to Eastern Congo and South Sudan and Iraq, and I had been to all these different crisis areas and places where oppression and was a thing. But this I had never seen before. The level to which these people were being oppressed, the level to which they were being surveilled, detained, tortured, murdered, the siege around the place, the inability to escape. I used to call it an open-air prison, but I've also learned from my Palestinian friends in the meantime that that's actually not really fair, because a prison implies that it has prisoners there, which means they have done something wrong. So it is more like actually a concentration camp. It was, and every single story from every single person that I met there was lowered my bar for humanity. And I already had quite a low bar seeing the things I had seen, and I constantly have this hope of like, humans are good and humans are good. But Gaza, honestly, it really, really challenged my view on that sense, because the people in Palestine that I met, were actually also, and this has to be said, they were wonderful people across the board. And we met people in kind of various layers of society, because that's the wonderful thing about making documentaries is you have to get into people's lives, and you have tea with people, and you meet some people on a policy level, and you meet some people in the humanitarian space. And these people just wanted to share their stories and wanted to share their lives. But, and they were so kind and so warm and so inviting. And the contrasts on the other side of the wall, or, you know, in Israel, or, you know, authorities in Israel, or the defense force in Israel, the way we were treated by them just for even going into Gaza. And I mean, it's important to understand this was like it was a UNICEF mission. So it was a humanitarian, it had a humanitarian context. Like the film we made didn't have like a political drive. It was more just understanding what, you know, children in this situation were going to school like what they were living like, because it was a part of a VR film series that we were making about where children learn. Mm-hmm. And we had an episode in Nepal. We had an episode in Kibera, which is a slum just outside of Nairobi. And then we had an episode in Gaza. So there was no like political angle to the film, but even so, I felt the way that I was looked at by Israeli authorities just for even saying that I was going into Palestine and going into Gaza. I didn't feel like I was looked at as a human. Mm-hmm. And it just struck me that I was like, and this is me with a Belgian passport and a UN team and a film crew and all these things. I just imagined like, what is this like for people who are actually, you know, living there and living this, and oppressed by this regime and besieged by this regime. And, I remember coming back from that trip and just being so angry. I couldn't even place the anger I felt, because I was like, how is it possible that this is so blatant and so clear? And I was only there for like 2 or 3 weeks, but it didn't take long to understand what was going on. And I kept repeating to myself, like, it's not that complicated. It's pretty clear what's going on here. Nobody is trying to keep it a secret. How is that possible? The main conclusion that I came to then, and the main question I had was, and it's a dark question, why is Gaza still there? And why is the West Bank still there? Because with all the resources being thrown at this oppressive regime, the might of the American military-industrial complex being thrown at this oppressive regime, and still these little bits of country remain. And I just found myself wondering why. That was when I started digging deeper, and I actually got in touch with somebody who I had met in South Sudan before and who's done a bunch of work around Israel-Palestine, Anthony Lowenstein. He's a writer. And he wrote the book, The Palestine Laboratory, and which is all about kind of battle-tested surveillance technology and military technology that Israel kind of exports around the world, but basically using the Palestinian people as a resource almost to test military technology on. Uh-huh. And to be honest, like, that was the sickening conclusion that I drew as well coming out of that place. I still have a hard time placing the trauma that I have from there, and I feel kind of bad even calling my thing a trauma, because I have friends who fled from there to here in the meantime and literally live in Ghent and with me, and when I talk to them and when we talk about their lives up to this point, I think most people can't imagine the darkness that they've experienced. Right. What struck me was that when we talk about that dynamic between Israel and Palestine, when I talk to the Palestinians were often like, we don't want Hamas, we don't want the Israelis, we just want peace and freedom, which is a very kind of straightforward and simple to understand and just narrative. Whereas whenever I talk to somebody who is from the other side of the wall, suddenly there's all these complications that gets thrown in, and there's all these like these holy books that need to be referenced and all these things. And it's not to minimize that in any way, but like if we talk about the last 75 years, to me, it's pretty straightforward. It's a settler colony that's increasingly oppressed and grown its allies, and with European and American funding has just slowly pushed a group of people from their land.
Yeah. And, on that, I hear a lot of people, in fact, I got an email this morning, why don't they just leave? Why don't they just leave? Leave their land, leave the ocean that they love, leave the culture that they've known. Why aren't they complicit in erasure of who they are? Right? Why don't they leave? With regards to the journalism that's been attacked and actually how we became connected, you were part of an Al Jazeera article that focused on the suppression that, here advocates and activists such as yourself with a wealth of knowledge and experience coming from a very humanitarian place are finding that they're being canceled, that their comments are being deleted, that, and when you're not even saying anything. I know myself, I actually gave someone a compliment. Next thing you know, I get it had nothing. I said nothing. But,
wow.
And next thing you know, it's you have violated, your comment is being deleted. And when we talk about how democracy dies in darkness and how journalists are the guardians of democracy. They are there to keep us accountable. They are there to let us know what's happening. I remember my grandfather, when I was a kid, I'd walk into the house and he'd say, "What's happening in the world today?" And if I said, I don't know, oh my goodness, I would get a complete rant on why I needed to know what was happening in the world. And I could not just be focused on myself. And I'm grateful for that. But at the same token, I recognize that half the time I'm not really getting from the media, and that, it is a biased media. And as I've said, thank goodness for social media at this point, because if it was not for social media, the information that is getting out, we wouldn't have the view into this crisis the way that we do. In your experience, and when you were in as part of that article, share with us your frustration and share with us, your perspective on why this really does threaten us. Because as an American society, right, I'm speaking from the Americans, don't take away my freedom of speech. Why should people recognize that whenever that type of behavior is happening, it is a threat to us all?
This is one of those real, kind of masks are off moments. I think we had it with in recent history with COVID-19. We had it I think you and I are people who can remember things like 9/11 happening, like those kinds of big, fundamental societal shift moments. This is absolutely one of those too for me, where you suddenly, I'm very connected to people on the ground in Palestine. And so when this started happening, I instantly started messaging them and getting videos from them about what was going on. And I got in touch with the reality on the ground. Right. And that was all through social media, WhatsApp, but also Instagram and TikTok as well, and all these things. So I knew the reality on the ground, and I also had this kind of fundamental understanding of what it was like from having been there myself. And then to see, at least here in Europe, also in America, because I follow American media outlets as well, to see the way the narrative was just being so one-sided, and the words that were being used to describe things was absolutely terrifying. It's kind of like it gets this really kind of existential fear and dread of but what has everything that I've been reading my entire life been? And to me, that this was such a clear example of that, of the focus on these attacks and the justification of this escalation in bombardments and things, and ironically, this historical justification ignoring the recent history, which I found very strange. There was all these mind-bending things happening of whose land is whose and all these things, but to me, as you said before the interview here, but it's kind of it was always waiting to happen. And that was the situation that was created and perpetuated. And the Hamas attacks of October 7th are, we can absolutely condemn them. They were horrific. But I also have the ability to place them in their slightly broader context, in the sense of, like, if a people is oppressed, violent resistance is usually a symptom of that oppression. Mm-hmm. So to expect that that's not going to happen is just factually incorrect. And as a side note, armed resistance against oppression is legal within international humanitarian law. This is not to justify Hamas's actions, and they can be prosecuted as war crimes, although I don't know how the International Criminal Court would judge that, because, like I said, if you're talking about people being oppressed, and if organizations like Amnesty International can see the Palestinians and the Israelis and living in an apartheid state, I wonder what the call would be. But to me, like, this whole focus and this, like, little narrative that's happening now, that's part of this much greater system, much better funded system of oppression. And then to see how the media was, like, using those to, like, kind of justify it, and even calling it a war.
Right.
That keeps driving me kind of nuts, to be honest, because, like, it's not a war. It never was a war. A war means there's, like, two nations that are fighting each other on somewhat kind of equal ground. Like Ukraine and Russia, that's a more kind of definable war situation. This, to me, was never a war. It was an oppression, it was an apartheid state, and it was careening and has now gone into full-fledged genocide.
Right.
And the fact that very few media outlets are actually even using that term is completely insane to me.
I agree. And I think that history will look back on them and they will maybe feel differently, because two things that I want to say to what you've said. And, you know, I mentioned this in another episode on the season. Let's just say that the Jewish people that were being held in concentration camps had somehow managed to rise up against the Nazis. Would we call them terrorists, right? And furthermore, for people who don't know their history, they should recognize that there were resistance groups a part of the Jewish community. They did try to use violence to exert some sort of freedom from the oppression that they were feeling, you know. And to your point about war, I agree. And I shared it on my social media a couple weeks back, but I was caught in the 2000, my family was caught in the 2000 conflict. I only wasn't personally physically there because my son was colicky and I didn't want to make the journey. But my husband at the time was in the airport when Israeli forces bombed it in July of 2006, following Hezbollah kidnapping 2 soldiers. Now, to your point, people call this the Lebanese-Israeli war. But what my family, my entire immediate family experienced was a consistent bombardment, of innocent civilian lives, a complete demolition of 15 years of infrastructure that was demolished in a week. And yet, let's call it a war. No, let's call this an aggression once again against, a neighbor. And just not saying that the 2 soldiers' lives didn't matter, but consistently we see that, okay, well, for every one Israeli life, we're going to decimate an entire village and we're going to call it justice. And, it's hard to swallow that. And it's hard to sit there and in fact, I don't watch a lot of the media. I try to read because, when I hear certain words and I hear that language, I'm with you, Thomas. I'm just like, are you kidding me? You've got to be kidding. So filmmaking right now and the unadulterated truth is critical. How do you really feel that people should be focused on that? How can that be accomplished? What efforts are you doing together? Because I can tell by what you are, you've already had one. And for people who haven't watched, there are amazing documentaries on these subjects. Born in Gaza is currently on Netflix. I encourage everyone to watch it. But yes, for you, what do you feel is most important? How can people do that? And what do you feel your move is towards speaking on this crisis?
The first thing I felt the need to do was to speak from my experience. And that was also the first thing I did was I just grabbed the camera and I just said, look, this is my take on it, because I think everyone in my direct environment is getting it wrong. And I wanted to be loud about it. I think that was important. And I think that is important for everyone. I think everyone needs to be loud about this because in 5, 10, 15 years time, I'm sure we'll have our policymakers standing at some remembrance saying, oh, if only we had known. Right. And like we do with Rwanda, like we do with the Holocaust. So my first instinct was, let's try as much as we can to just call this what it is, and mainstream that language. I thought that was my first intention, was like, this is a genocide. People need to start using that word because it is clear as day to me. It's not a secret. It's well documented. All the red flags are up. Most of the experts agree. So that was to me like, okay, that's step one. And that's very just like, doing what we can to like kind of frame the narrative at somewhat closer to the truth. I think what I've also started investing in is my contacts here in Ghent. There's a big kind of Palestinian community that I'm very involved in. They all have their stories, because obviously from, this escalation of the conflict is just the newest chapter. There's been so many decades of atrocities and horrific stories of oppression. And these stories also need to be told. And so I'm kind of putting all the tools I have, all the capacity I have left, I'm throwing them at this, because it is also what I do. Like I've spent so much time with my team kind of gathering genocide survivor testimony, a lot of it focused on the Holocaust, some of it even focused, as you were saying earlier, on Jewish resistance movements during the Holocaust. So I know that narrative quite well as well. But I feel like the Palestinians we need to amplify their voices. And we need to amplify everyone's voices who's talking about them, because they're being suppressed, and they're being silenced. And there is this massive machine of communication and propaganda that is working against them. So we need to do everything we can to kind of wage that, for lack of a better word, the communications war in the other direction to get closer to the truth.
The same way that we celebrated the end of the apartheid in South Africa, the same way that we celebrated the Berlin Wall coming down, do you hope and pray for a day that wall comes down in Gaza, that this region can somehow move to a place where, I'm speaking really dreamfully here, where the re-education of even Israeli people can be one that says, hey, that person over there deserves integrity and life and freedom no differently than I do, and their existence does not threaten me. Do you hope and pray for a day where we can maybe see that?
I do still have hope for that, Aalia. Because I do believe in people. And I also know that the majority of the people don't want the situation like it is right now. I think there is a group of the highest of privileged, the most elite, who are calling shots, for various reasons, whether it's like religious fundamentalism or whether it's resource or, geopolitical strategy, or there are all these justifications for it. But I know that most of the people, also in Israel, because you could see all this this noise on the streets in Israel in the last few weeks and months and years and decades even, there are people who are very unhappy with the situation as it is and see the oppression of the Palestinians for what it is. And likewise on the Palestinian side, I mean, that was the time I was in Gaza was kind of around the time of the height of the March of Return, where every Friday they would march to the wall and in the peaceful kind of resistance. Unfortunately, that it didn't really do anything, which I always find such a sad fact, because I've been in movements, I've been on the streets, I've shouted about things, and the constant disillusionment of, shouting into the void and getting nothing from your policymakers in return is disheartening. But I do believe, I really do believe that if you were to give a true voice to the people, if we would have democratic institutions that really did represent the voices of the people on the ground, I believe that that is possible. But it is about that. And this brings me back to the beginning of our conversation, where you have these massive geopolitical institutions that lack proper representation. I think that is possibly the key to actually fulfilling that almost utopian kind of hope that we dare to still have, Aalia.
I'm with you. So I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your story, your openness, your heart, to be quite honest. I know it's not easy. For people to support you, where can they do that? Where can they see your work? Where can they donate to your work? Please let us know. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm most active on the socials on Instagram, on TikTok, just under my name, Thomas Maddens. You can actually see most of my films. They're all available on my website at madfilms.eu. And there you can also kind of get a bit more information about what it is I do and what my work is, because, I mean, I'm a filmmaker, but I am also very much an activist, because I use my film as a tool for impact. And you can see kind of what we do there and what we're working on currently. So those are the places to follow me. And I always say to people, get in touch, because I do respond and my team does respond. We're interested in hearing other people's stories and other perspectives, and collaborating with other creative people. So please get in touch and let us know how you'd like to work together. I love that. And I definitely am, going to continue supporting and checking you out. And as a fellow, I mean, this is the behind Unsugarcoated Media, and the word unsugarcoated tells it all. This is what, and I take great pride in being a social impact producer, an impact producer, because for all the great things we experience, and like you, privilege, whatever people want to call it, and I haven't always had that, but just to have it now the way that I do, if I'm not doing something that serves humanity with it, then, I don't really want to do it. So I completely understand. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to actually, having more conversations with you in the future. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it, Aalia, and thank you so much for this and for creating this platform and directing it towards this, because it's so important, and the fact that you have that whole personal connection to it, I think it can pull people in, and it can make it so much more human than just these talking points that we're getting in kind of the mainstream media narrative. So thank you, Aalia, for all your work as well.
Thank you. Inshallah, as we say, right?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are at home, look, I'm going to share something with you. My son, who is only 18 years old, he is half Palestinian himself. And after this, in these conversations that I've had to have with my children consistently, he said something to me that I found quite profound. He said, "Mom, both sides need to be forgiven." And I know that a lot of people are not going to want to hear that. That does not mean that people have not done wrong. That does not mean that people do not need to be held accountable. But if we are ever, as as Thomas and I just spoke about. And really, truly, it is the tenet of conflict resolution, which I don't even think my son even fully understood what he was talking about. And when he said it, I'm like, you mean conflict resolution? And in order to achieve that, you have to, we interviewed once Jeff Gomez. He was one of the producers on Avatar. We all love Avatar. But if you look at that movie, what was it about? An aggressive, oppressive machines. These people just trying to live life, enjoy their culture. And in order for, what he talked about in that interview was the conflict resolution. Right now, right here, we leave everything else behind. And we speak from a place of hope when we say that. We need that clarity. We need that type of thinking to happen right now across the globe, in every single household, from every single mother, from every single grandmother, from every single father. For God's sakes, we need it now. Furthermore, while I am not anti-Israeli, I am anti-mindset that causes any person to believe that they need to hate someone else. And nothing kills me more when I see interviews of people who somehow have adopted a belief that they're not good. They're a threat to our world. They're a threat to our existence. It kills my soul, because if we really look back at World War II and the vitriol and the true extremism of the Nazis, like I said, we were all happy when we could finally celebrate their freedom, their liberation, the apartheid, the Berlin Wall. Palestinians deserve that right now. They deserve our support. They deserve our humanity. And for people in the Israeli community, if you also want to have that same peace, then we have to come to a resolution that makes sense for everyone. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy. Most of all, I appreciate you letting us be unsugar-coated. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Take care.